time. I guess this is my first one trying to do it in English. I kind of made the channel as a way for me to practice my French and give ASMR a try, I guess. But I'm gonna try new things out and go from there, because that was a long time ago when I first started the channel, and I still plan on continuing to make videos in French to keep practicing it, but it's definitely less exhausting for me to speak in English, so it's a little bit easier for me to produce content in this way, and hopefully I can produce a little bit more content. But I am going to do another reading, and I'm actually going to read Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Some of you might know it, some of you might not. It's one of the 4 main classical works of literature of classical Chinese literature. I grew up with this, and I loved the video games. I think a lot of people probably know this story because of Dynasty Warriors. I loved it too, so yeah, that definitely led me to want to read this book in entirety when I was younger, and it's been a really long time since I read it, so I'm kind of excited to read it again. I forgot a lot of it, but I think today I'm probably just going to start with the introduction. It's pretty late, so I'll just go ahead with that. Yeah, it's a pretty long story, so lots of content for videos, I guess. Alright, so we got a bit of a quick introduction here, which I'll read. Yeah. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is regarded by the Chinese as their greatest novel. Its perennial allure, by no means diminished in the China of today, springs mainly from its basis in exciting historical fact and its telling portrayal of human ambition against a background of adventure and intrigue. No less fascinating are its accounts of human nature in reaction against the arbitrary restraints imposed by a conformist society. Through its pages, as through the length of a Chinese picture scroll, passes a continuous spectacle of striking scenes and events, each completely absorbing in itself, but at the same time playing its part in the grand overall design. These scenes are peopled with hundreds of colorful characters that bring to the novel its dramatic power and its frequently astonishing realism. Its enduring popularity, in fact, stems no less from its remarkable characterizations than from its wealth of theatrical incident, and it is hardly surprising to note that the romance is the ultimate source for hundreds of spine-tingling plots in the modern Chinese opera repertoire. In A History of Chinese Literature, Herbert A. Giles effectively expresses the quality of the romance. It consists mainly of stirrings, scenes of warfare, of cunning plans by skillful generals, and of doughty deeds by blood-stained warriors. Armies and fleets of countless myriads are from time to time annihilated by one side or another. All this in an easy and fascinating style, which makes the book an endless joy to old and young alike. The romance is a product of 14th century China, although the events it depicts occurred some centuries earlier. It is also the product of imaginative treatment by generations of storytellers, dramatists, and poets, a vast bulk of material from which the presumptive author, Lo Guangcheng, composed what is undoubtedly one of the world's major works of fiction. The masterly translation by C.H. Brewitt Taylor is here presented in a new edition with an illuminating introductory essay by Roy Andrew Miller, who received his PhD in Chinese Studies at Columbia. So we have here a map of China during the Three Kingdoms period, which was in 220 to 265 AD. I'm just going to try to show it here. Yeah, so we have the Shu Kingdom, all the way to the west here, and the south. So that's where Liu Bei had his kingdom, and then we had the eastern Wu here, and the northern Wei kingdom here. Sorry, I feel like I'm dragging this thing around everywhere. Okay. So like I said, I'm just going to read the introduction. That should be good. Empires wax and wane, states cleave asunder and coalesce. This is the sobering reflection with which China's great 14th century historical novel, Sangguozhi Yanyi, here titled Romance of the Three Kingdoms, begins. And it is a paraphrase of the same sentiment that, 120 chapters later, brings the book to a close. But the inevitability of change in human life and government is far from the actual theme of the work. Its subject matter is really nothing so elevated as this, and certainly not the detached treatise the phrase might suggest. The book is rather a historical romance of major proportions, a fascinating novel whose chief theme is the nature of human ambition. This no doubt explains why, until modern times, fiction of the general type of the Sangguo has not been highly thought of by traditional Chinese scholars. An anomaly has resulted in the traditional Chinese system of cultural values. A complete history of literature could very well be written without ever mentioning this work, or the other important examples of its genre. The traditional Chinese scholar has, until recently, hardly ever been willing to consider worthy of study as literature most works that the Occidental scholar would wish to include under the term. At the same time, the major part of what the Mandarin would regard as important literature has been official prose and documents of a variety that most persons in the West could hardly be induced even to take seriously. Since this is so, it is relevant to ask how China got such novels as the Sangguo in the first place, who wrote them and who read them. The first are fairly difficult questions, as we shall see below, but the last is simpler. The same people who most looked down on these novels, namely the members of the scholar official class, wrote them and also avidly read them. This is not to imply, of course, that novels like the Sangguo have been exclusively the property of China's literati for centuries. They have also been enjoyed by Chinese in every walk of life, and their plots and characters are especially familiar to generations of even illiterate Chinese through dramatizations on the popular stage. This is especially true of the Sangguo, the ultimate source for hundreds of the spine-tingling and ear-splitting scripts of the modern Chinese opera. As for China's officials, in their working hours they were committed to an elaborate and enervating denial of the validity of the analysis of human society, which these novels set forth with such insight. But off-duty, as it were, they found in these books frank, straightforward, and utterly fascinating accounts of the reaction of human nature against the arbitrary shackles which their own Confucian society had imposed upon it. The great popularity that works like the Sangguo have always enjoyed in China no doubt stems from this. Their readers cannot but have found on every page an essentially valid analysis of society that impressed them all events and anecdotes which form the chief interest of the novel are purely fictional, the result of literally centuries of slow accretion and collection. The Chinese have always been interested in accounts of their own history, but at the same time, when the Sanghua text was most likely being assembled into more or less the form in which we have it today, this interest was especially great. China was then under foreign rule, occupied from 1260 to 1368 by the armies of the Mongol horde. Not simply interest, but even a kind of nostalgia naturally attached to the far-off days of the Han emperors and their successors. The rulers of the three kingdoms of Shu, Wu, and Wei. The historical facts of the period themselves were and still are quite exciting enough for any novel, but to these the imagination and inventive power of generations of popular storytellers, dramatists, and poets have added an almost overpowering wealth of illustrative anecdote, incident, and legend. One is reminded of Browning's conceit that his heretic's tragedy should be read as a glimpse, as distorted by the refraction from Flemish brain to brain during the course of a couple of centuries. It is exactly such refraction from brain to brain that is the real author of the Sanghua. To work all this material together into something resembling the well-constructed work of fiction which we have today in this novel may not then have been literary composition as it is generally understood in the West, but it was surely a literary accomplishment of the first order, no matter how the terms are to be defined. Modern studies of the text here translated have made it possible to trace its growth in considerable detail through a slow process of accretion extending over literally several hundred years. The civil disturbances from the collapse of the Han hegemony down to the reunification of the country under the Qin state in 265 had been treated by several poets at least as early as the second decade of the 9th century, and stories of daring do and the military adventures of these stirring times were widely current in China of the late 11th century and after. Of major importance in its growth were semi-theatrical recitations on these same themes by professional raconteurs. The great debt which the novel in its present form owes to their inventions and conceits is still clearly visible throughout its entire length. From the recitations of these storytellers, the tales of the period were further developed into fully staged theatrical performances. Their libretti were then, in turn, committed to writing, often in the form of illustrated prompt books, thus once more recasting the same materials into another transient literary form. It is at this point in the history of the novel that the name of Lo Guanchong, its presumptive author, first appears. Later bibliographical sources are unanimous in attributing its first recension in anything resembling the present state of the text to him. Lo is also thought to have been the author of several other important early Chinese novels. Through their sheer bulk and mutual divergencies of style, are difficult to reconcile with a single author. Who Lo Guanchong was, and when he lived, are both equally obscure. He is said to have been a native of Taiyuan in modern Shanxi province, northeast China, and the author of a later catalog of dramatic works mentions having had a reunion with him in 1364. But 60 years had passed by the time he noted it down, and he admits that by the time he had lost track of Lo and had no idea what had become of him. And this casual reference to the man appears to be the only contemporary notice of him that has survived. Though we thus know next to nothing about the man, it is not unreasonable to assume that Lo Guanchong was a potential member of China's ruling class of scholar officials, but for some reason was this vast novel, but again, speculation will probably not lead us too far astray. Whether unemployed by choice or force of circumstances, the man responsible for the present text of the Sanghua was a complete realist about the inner workings of China's Confucian state. He shows with complete candor, and even at times a startling frankness, just how much of the functioning of the monolithic China state was due to the will of heaven, and how much to the ambition of clever, ruthless men. The scenes of the abdication of the last Han ruler, forced to hand his throne over to the heir of the wily Cao Cao's, not once but 3 times, are written with a frankness and sophisticated disillusionment with official cant, perhaps unmatched in all Chinese literature, with the possible exception of certain literati satires of a later period, as Cao Bei at last consents to take the throne, which his father spent a lifetime in wrestling for him. With every trick and stratagem in the book, he snorts, "At last I understand just how it was that the virtuous rulers of antiquity got their power." One may read much Chinese literature and find few passages as realistic as this, or as full of dramatic power. Surely it is not looking too far to find here the outpourings of a disappointed and rejected scholar official, turned to assembling works of fiction from his complete disillusionment over the transparent hypocrisies of the official Chinese view of man and the state. Obscure as the figure of Lo Guangcheng is, there seems little reason to doubt that behind the present text of the novel there was a single author who brought into workable form the vast bulk of tales and all but unconnected episodes that had grown up around the historical figures of 3rd century China. Whoever he was, he put together one of the world's major works of fiction, a vast but coherent and amazingly well-constructed historical romance. It is important to note, however, that there is much more in the Sanghua than just these fascinating glimpses into the Chinese body politics in the 14th century. The 3 main figures among the hundreds who make their appearance in these pages are especially drawn with literary skill and discrimination. Liu Bei, the legitimate Han heir, is presented with great sympathy and consideration. His character, as found in the Sanghua, is no doubt a kind of literary distillation of the popular conception of the man as it had developed in the storyteller's versions, and the dramas dealing with the events of the period. For popular enthusiasm for this particular symbol of legitimacy and loyalty was especially strong when, as in the 13th and 14th centuries, China found itself encumbered with the armies of a foreign invader. This considerably idealized book. The fictional Guan Yu has completely replaced the historical one in the Chinese imagination. When he is mentioned at all today, it is the figure as he appears in this novel that the Chinese have in mind, and this in fact tends to be true of all the characters appearing in the book. It is, for example, the idealized Liu Bei of the novel who survives in the Chinese tradition, even though, as Professor Tamaki Ogawa has pointed out in the introduction to his Japanese translations of the novel, there is little, if anything, in the historical record to justify the gracious treatment which he has been accorded. In the view of the Orthodox historian Chen Shou, for example, the main difference between Liu Bei and Cao Cao was simply that Liu was rather less successful in employing largely the same kind of tactics as those the wicked Cao used. If Chang Fei, the third of the chief characters, is for many modern readers the most successful figure in the book, the reasons are not difficult to discover. With him, the novel is firmly set on the solid ground of a perfectly approachable, perfectly believable, and completely realistic human figure. As a fictional character, he is thus of great importance not only in China, but probably also in world literature. It would be difficult at any rate to find other early examples of fictional characters so mentioned in any appreciation, no matter how short. The infamous Cao Cao is so well known that it is always refreshing on rereading the novel to find again just how skillfully done the character is. It is also just as interesting to note that Lo Guanzhong and the countless other authors who in one form or another contributed to the development of this character, and the others in the novel, really was far more fond of the wily Cao than he cared to show. Like many of the villains of fiction, he is not really on bad terms with the author at all, who actually devotes much loving care to his characterization. Milton, for all his trying, could not get nearly as interested in God as he was in Satan, and Lo Guanzhong and his many nameless collaborators have all obviously found it is quite difficult to be as interested in their exemplars of loyalty as in this paragon of wicked conduct. With the figure of Zhuge Kongming, the novel reaches out into fields less familiar to Western readers. The areas of enchantment, magic, and sorcery. It is actually surprising to find how small a part the supernatural plays in the Sanguo. Much Chinese fiction devotes more attention to it, and is rather less interesting as a result. But in traditional Chinese thought, the boundaries between this world and the next are anything but rigid, and for Chinese readers there is little, if anything, unreal or unbelievable about a figure like Zhuge Kunming. In Chinese terms, he is simply a man of exceptional talents and remarkable gifts. These include traffic with the spirit world and wizardry in magic and spells, but do not make him any less of a mortal or realistic figure. Structurally, Zhuge Kongming plays a vital role in this vast drama. He is the chief figure on the stage during the transition portion between the early section, which deals with adventures of Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei from their oath of loyalty in the Peach Garden, down to the final forced abdication of the Han House, and the final section which deals with the actual period of the Three Kingdoms, the defeat of the Shu and Wu states by the state of Wei, and Wei's own eventual collapse before the emergent Qin, as once again empires wax and wane and states cleave asunder and coalesce. In attempting to speak of the overall structure of the novel, it is tempting to employ a comparison with a Chinese landscape painting with figures on a scroll of an enormous length. Exactly as in the case of such a scroll painting, the novel presents a long, continuous spectacle which is passed before our eyes, but only a single episode is visible at any one time, or need be, since in the individual portion immediately before us there is always action enough to keep the attention fixed, and detail enough to be totally engrossing. But it would be a mistake to permit either the sheer length of the composition or its wealth of detail to conceal from us the fact that there is here an overall plan in which each individual section plays its own important role. Again, the metaphor of a landscape painting scroll fits well, just as a Chinese landscape scroll has its carefully planned climaxes and crescendo-like swellings of interest. So this Sanguo is caught up in carefully placed foci of excitement and emotion from time to time, giving articulation and structure to what otherwise might have been simply an interminable assembly of anecdotes and narrative cliches. From its vigorous beginning with the Peach Garden Oath of Loyalty by the three chief figures, the novel continues at a slow but carefully calculated pace. With the abdication of the Han House, the tempo quickens, the death of Guan Yu, the assassination of Zhang Fei, and above all the unforgettable passing of Zhuge Kongming, and his star returns to heaven in a battlefield scene of striking dramatic power. All these bring the narrative into sharpened focus time and time again, like great wave surges standing out against the ever-moving, gently swelling sea of human ambition. Then, near the end, the tempo quickens again as the almost stately drama of the Three Kingdoms proper unfolds, state pitted against state in a series of futile and pointless battles, until at long last the inevitable hegemony of Qin is established. over. The last few quiet episodes of the scroll remain to be unrolled. The story is told. Wow, spoiler alerts. I'm sorry. Yeah, definitely spoiled some parts if you don't know the story. Just to clarify, I guess, Zhuge Gongming, that is Zhuge Liang. And if you know Dynasty Warriors, then you probably recognize his name as Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Gongming, whenever he's mentioned, that is the same person. Alright, so I look forward to getting started on this and reading the first chapter, which is The Oath in the Peach Garden. One of my favorite scenes in the story for sure. Thanks a lot, and have a good night.